CHAPTER VI. Of Divers Women, by Pansy and Mrs. C.M. Livingston. Where He Spent Christmas. "Oh, mother, I will get back before it snows much, and I shall not mind if a few flakes of snow do light on me. Please do not object to my going. A walk is just what I'm longing for." And Edna Winters drew on her gloves, and stepped from the door of her home, a low roofed farmhouse on the hill, which in its grey old age seemed a part of the hill itself. It was not the beauty of the afternoon that tempted Edna out, for the leaden sky almost met the grey hills; and all wore the same sober hue, sky, hills, house, and leafless trees. The wind howled fiercely through the group of pine trees in the yard, that seemed but deep shadows on the general greyness, and occasional flakes of snow were already falling about. Father Winters looked through the front window after his daughter and shook his head, saying, "Mother, there's a great storm brewing, if I'm not mistaken. The child ought not to have gone." Then the mother came and anxiously inspected the sky, although she only said, "Oh, well, she is young, and don't mind the weather like us old folks. I was 20 years old myself once, and I remember just how tired I used to get cooped up in the house so much. Besides, she wanted to go to the post office. Tomorrow is Christmas, you know, and the office will not be open but an hour or two." Mr. Winters was growing old, and the rheumatism was keeping him a prisoner just now, so he came back to the fire and his newspaper. The little city wherein was the post office lay a little over 2 miles away, and Edna often walked in and out for the mere pleasure of it. Even on this dismal day she tripped lightly along, humming a glad measure, stopping a moment in the edge of the pine woods to gather a few squawberries and a bit of moss, then, casting a glance at the threatening sky, hurried on her way. Before she reached the town the snow was falling thick and fast, and was blown by the wind into little mounds almost as soon as it came down. She was fairly blown inside the door of the post office, feathery flakes adorning her from head to foot. Mr. Hugh Monteith had also come to the post office. He had merely stepped across the street from his banking house, and stood waiting for the afternoon mail to be distributed. He turned his head carelessly as the door opened to admit Edna. She took off the veil that enveloped her head, shook and brushed herself, and walked over to the stove. Then Mr. Monteith's inner consciousness told him that there was the very face he had been in search of for years. Then he did what was not found in his code of etiquette. He stared, although he did retreat behind a pillar while doing so. He took in the whole picture. The face, of that pure, clear tint that belongs only to a certain type of brown eyes and hair, the hair gathered into a coil at the back of the head, except 1 or 2 loose curls that strayed down from it, the eyes sweet and serious. Mr. Monteith dealt many hours of the day with dollars and cents, notes and bills. Still, he knew poetry when he saw it, and that golden brown curl was to him a bit of a poem. Then her dress was peculiar. His fastidious taste pronounced it perfect for the occasion. Walking dress of soft, dark brown, glinted by a lighter shade of the same colour. A jaunty brown jacket of substantial cloth, a little brown hat, with a brown and white wing perked on one side of it. No colour except a soft pink that the cold air had laid on the cheeks with delicate skill. His quick eye noted, too, the neat glove, the well-fitting little boot poised on the hearth of the stove. She looked like a little brown thrush about to spread its wings, but she did not fly, she walked over to the delivery and received a package of letters and papers, asking in low, clear tones, "Is the Eastern mail in?" The voice was in keeping with eyes and hair and dress, pure, refined, cultured. Mr. Monteith's resolution was quickly made. He secured his mail and followed Edna. Who could she be? He supposed he knew all the young ladies in town, but where did this revelation of loveliness drop from? He turned corner after corner as she did, not caring where he went, only so that he kept her in view. To his astonishment he soon found himself in the open country. It was not a day that he would have chosen for a pleasure walk in the country. The snow eddied and whirled, and almost blinded him. But if he lost his face, his ideal realized, should he ever find it again? There was no choice, so on he strode, congratulating himself that he happened to have on an overcoat and heavy boots. The little brown clad figure ahead of him sped briskly on, and faster came the snow. Things were beginning to look serious. The wind roared and howled through the pine woods, blowing the snow into drifts in the road. Mr. Monteith had a new motive for his journey now. He must protect this young girl in her lonely way. It was out of the question to leave her in such a desolate place and a storm raging. He quickened his steps. She might need assistance. A feeling of despair was beginning to creep over Edna. What if she should sink down in this lonely place unable to go on? She had left the main road a few minutes before, and this one by the pine woods was not much travelled. It was probable that nobody would find her. In dismay she turned and looked behind her, but no sooner did she see a man rapidly coming towards her than a mortal fear took possession of her, and she started forward with new impetus. On and on she ran, as fleetly as a deer. Mr. Monteith ran too at the top of his speed, wondering, inly, if she really were of the earth, and if she had not some means of locomotion that he did not possess. He must reach her at all events. Edna at last paused in dismay before an immense drift that lay directly across the road. She would have plunged in, but Mr. Monteith was at her side and said pleasantly, "If you will allow me to go on first, I think I can tread a path for you." Edna looked up quickly, somewhat reassured by the manly tones, and the gray eyes that looked into hers were true eyes. A little child might have known that. "Before we go on, let me introduce myself," and Mr. Monteith drew out a card and handed it to Edna. When Edna read "Hugh Monteith and Company, Bankers," all her fear left her. The name of Monteith had long been a familiar one to her. She remembered hearing her father speak of having a little business with that bank. "Well, I am Edna Winters," said Edna simply. "My father is Samuel Winters, and we live a little more than half a mile from here." "Then we are acquainted, I am sure, for your father is one of our depositors. Now let me break a road through this barricade, if possible," and Mr. Monteith dashed bravely into it, but as well as he could see through the blinding storm, the drift reached a long distance ahead. It would be a work of time to tread it down, and the cold wind cut like a knife. There was a shorter way. This was no time for ceremony or trifling. He came back to Edna's side, saying, "It will be almost impossible to do it. We must hasten on, or perish in this storm. Trust me, this is best." And the tall form stooped and lifted Edna from her feet, as if she had been a feather, before she had time to realize his purpose. Then, with long strides, he waded into the sea of snow. Neither spoke, but the girl that was borne along in the strong arms did a large amount of thinking. Despite the danger and the gallantry of her protector, she could not but feel a little provoked at having been snatched up in that style without her leave, as if she were a bale of cotton; provoked, too, at herself for getting into such a predicament. If she had only stayed at home, as mother advised! Mother had always told her she had feared something would happen to her going through those woods by herself, and here it had come. Then the funny side presented itself. She wanted to laugh, but was afraid to. She stole a glance at the face below her. A finely cut face it was, but there was no smile in the grave eyes. Instead, an intense, earnest purpose. When they came again to the ground where the snow lay on a level, Edna was put again on her feet, her hand drawn through Mr. Monteith's arm, and the two plodded on. It was almost a silent journey. The snow coming directly in their faces, and the wind fairly taking their breaths, made it no time for formal talk. Wherever the drifts had thrown up a barrier she was again lifted and borne through them, but not set down again, for Edna's protector had discovered that she was almost overcome by fatigue. try as she might to hide it. And when she said, "Let me walk now, if you please," he answered, "Miss Winters, you are my prisoner until I place you at your father's door." She submitted with good grace, and began to feel some dawnings of gratitude towards her deliverer. Old Mr. Winters had walked back and forth from the fire to the window for the last half hour. "Why don't the child come?" he said. "I'm sure something has happened to her. If I could only go out and see, but I should make poor headway, hobbling about in the drifts." He could do nothing himself, so he fled to his unfailing refuge, asking the God who rules the storms to protect his darling. Mrs. Winters had said for the 10th time, "Why, father, I think she wouldn't start back in this storm." Nevertheless, she placed her rocking chair close by the window, and looked down the road far more than she sewed. Their anxiety reached its height when they saw a stranger toiling up the hill bearing their daughter in his arms. The door was opened long before they reached it, and Edna called out, "I'm all right, mother." "Why, it's Mr. Monteith, as sure as I live," said Edna's father. "Yes, Mr. Winters," said Mr. Monteith, "I found a stray lamb of yours on the highway, and brought it home." "May God reward you," and Mr. Winters clasped his hand warmly. "I have been very anxious. I did not see what was to become of her if she was on her way in this terrible storm. How providential that you happened to be going her way." Mr. Monteith winced a little at this. "You will stay with us to night, of course," Mr. Winters said. "Oh no, indeed, thank you. I must get back before dark. Will rest a few minutes, though." The Storm King was out in full force that day, for during those few minutes huge banks piled themselves against windows and doors, and the wind shrieked and moaned like a demon, shaking the house to its foundations. "Now," said Mr. Winters as his guest rose to go, "it is madness for you to think of going home to night, and I must insist that you stay. I am disabled just now, or I would harness old Prince and get you through." Here Edna came in with her pleading eyes, and said, "Do stay, I know it is not safe for you to go." Motherly Mrs. Winters entreated also. How could he resist such urgency, especially when it exactly fitted in with what he desired above all things to do? He yielded, and was soon comfortably established in the large old rocker by the fire. And now he enjoyed the pleasure of a new experience. The stereotyped fashionable house he knew all about, but this old house that looked small, and yet stretched itself out into many cosy rooms, it was quaint, it was unique, and so was the little household. It was like stepping into a book, and that a book of poems. What was the charm of that low browed room he sat in? Could it be the broad fireplace, wherein blazed and snapped a veritable backlog? Mr. Winters had stoves to warm the house, but he insisted on keeping this fire to look at. When they all gathered about the tea table, his critical eye noted many little points that a less refined man would not have thought of. The fine white table linen, delicate old fashioned china, a piece or two of highly polished silver, and the table not vulgarly loaded with too great variety, yet everything delicious and abundant. Mr. and Mrs. Winters, too, though unpretending, were persons of refinement and intelligence. He was puzzled to understand how a young girl, reared in so much seclusion, should possess such grace and culture as did Edna. After tea, when she played and sang, his mystification increased, for the bird-like voice and delicate touch were superior to much that he heard among his city friends. It came out in the course of conversation, however, that Edna had spent the last 6 years in one of the finest schools in Boston, an inmate of her aunt's family; and now she had come back to them to gladden the eyes of those two who almost set her up as an idol; come back, not spoiled, taking up her daily little homely duties again with real zest. Mr. Monteith found Mr. Winters most congenial company. He had read extensively, and was keen in argument, throwing in a bit of poetry or a witty story as the case required. Edna brought her crocheting, and made herself into a picture in one corner of the fireplace, her changing, speaking face and piquant remarks lending interest to the dullest subject. "It is my opinion, Mr. Monteith," said Mr. Winters, as a fierce blast dashed sheets of snow against the windows, "that in all probability you will be obliged to spend your Christmas with us. If this storm continues at this rate, you will be a prisoner." "For which I shall be most devoutly thankful," he answered. "Well, our turkey is all ready, and we shall thank kind Providence for sending you to us, snow-bound as we are." Mr. Winters took down the old Bible and read a portion with judicious care, then a hymn and prayer, and the good nights, and Mr. Monteith was in the guest chamber, a little white room under the eaves, cold looking in its purity but for the firelight glow. The name of that chamber was Peace, thought Mr. Monteith, as his delighted eyes surveyed it, and with Bunyan's Pilgrim he felt that he had reached already the next door to heaven. It surely must be the chamber of peace, because the window opened towards the sun rising, and in the morning a glorious panorama spread itself before him. Fences and all unsightly objects had disappeared. Just one broad expanse of whiteness as far as the eye could reach. The rough old hills, from foot to summit, wore a robe of unsullied whiteness. The soft white garment rested lightly on roof and tree. Over all the rising sun shed rays of rosy light. It accorded well with Mr. Monteith's spirit when he heard Mr. Winters singing, "The New Jerusalem comes down, adorned with shining grace." The host and his visitor launched into a tide of talk immediately after breakfast. They had so many things in common to talk over that there seemed to be no end. So occupied was Mr. Monteith with the father that he seemed to bestow very little attention on the daughter. On the contrary, no word or look of hers escaped him. At one time the perilous walk of yesterday was the subject of conversation, and Mr. Winters was again expressing his gratitude. "So strange," he remarked, "that you should have been coming this way. How did you happen to start out in such a storm?" Mr. Monteith did not like to talk upon that subject. He murmured something about business, while a slight flush tinged his cheeks, and at once asked Mr. Winters what effect he supposed the resumption of specie payment would have upon the state of the country; and the unsuspecting old gentleman was ready to enter with avidity upon the discussion of that subject. The Christmas dinner duly disposed of, Edna played the piano, and Mr. Monteith delighted the old people by joining his exquisite tenor to Edna's voice in some old hymns. Mr. Winters called for his favourites, St. Martin's, Golden Hill, Exhortation, and listened with tears in his eyes at their faithful rendering, even essaying to put in a few notes of bass himself among the quavers of old St. Martin's. Not until the shadows began to steal into the room did Mr. Monteith take his departure, much to his own regret as well as that of his entertainers, with many promises of future visits. A few days after Christmas the stage driver left at the door a small box marked Samuel Winters. The old gentleman put on his glasses and opened it with much curiosity. Behold, there lay a lovely bouquet of roses, carnations, and violets. He lifted it with care, and a card marked Hugh Monteith fell from it. "That is odd," he said, with a roguish look at Edna, "to send these things to me. They are pretty though, I declare." And he buried his face in a fragrant rose, then involuntarily hummed, "How sweet the breath beneath the hill Of Sharon's dewy rose." Another prolonged inhalation, and he called, "Mother, come here and smell this pink. It's the very one that my mother used to border her flower beds with when I was a boy." Then he gave the bouquet into Edna's care while he went off, in imagination, into his mother's garden, tied up the sweet peas and trained the morning glories once again. How each flower, like a dear human face, stood before him looking into his eyes. The damask roses, the Johnny jump-ups, larkspur, bachelor buttons, ragged ladies, marigolds, hollyhocks, and a host of others that are out of fashion now. That bouquet furnished him a pleasant reverie for an hour. It brought no less pleasure to Edna. Their new friend had not forgotten them, and her intuitions told her for whom the lovely blossoms were intended. After that it grew to be quite a thing of course for Mr. Samuel Winters to receive a box of flowers. He always pretended to appropriate them to himself, much to Edna's glee, as he did the not infrequent visits of Mr. Monteith to the Pines, often remarking, after a pleasant evening's discussion, "That is an uncommon young man, coming so far to chat with me. He's one among 1,000. The most of them haven't time nowadays to give a civil word to an old man." He had a deeper purpose in this than might have been supposed. There were few things he did not think over as he sat looking into the fire. What if this young man should unwittingly steal away his darling's heart, and then flit away to some other flower, and leave this, his own treasure, with all the soul gone out of her life? He believed Mr. Monteith to be an honourable man, but then he would hedge this blossom of his about and guard it carefully. There should be no opportunity for tender speech that meant nothing. One day Edna was in town, passing through one of the busy streets. Among the gay turnouts came one that caught her attention instantly, a prancing span of greys before a great sleigh. Among the furs and gay robes sat Mr. Monteith and a young lady, beautiful to Edna as a dream. Even in the hurried glance she noted the pink and white complexion, the blue eyes peeping through golden frizzes, set off by a dark blue velvet hat with a long white plume. Mr. Monteith raised his hat and bowed low to Edna in pleased surprise. Edna went on with a little pang at her heart. It might have been less had she known that Miss Paulina Percival's invitation to ride came in this fashion. Making it convenient to emerge from a store just as Mr. Monteith came from the bank and was about to step into his sleigh, she engaged him in conversation, then exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Monteith, what a lovely span of greys! They match perfectly." Then with a pretty pout, "Naughty man, you never asked me to try them." "Suppose I ask you now," he said, and even while he spoke he said to himself, "Edna Winters would never have done that." Miss Percival needed no urging. She was soon seated in triumph by Mr. Monteith's side, the envy of many another city belle. That night Edna stood at the window of her little chamber, looking out on the fair earth glittering like diamonds in the moonlight. She was not often in the mood she found herself in to night; restless, gloomy, with no heart for anything. She began to take herself to task for it. Why had the light suddenly gone out of everything, and life to seem flat and dull? She knew why. It was simply because she had seen that bewitching looking girl riding with Mr. Monteith. And what of that? Was she foolish enough to believe that he cared for her, a simple country girl, just because he had given her a few flowers and called there? He probably considered these common attentions that he offered to many others. Her cheeks burned at the remembrance of the delight she had felt in his society. The last few weeks had been the happiest she had ever known. No words of his would justify her either. She was vexed at herself. Here it had turned out that she was just like any other silly girl, holding her heart in her hand, ready to bestow it unasked. In her self-accusing spirit she forgot that looks and tones may speak volumes in the absence of words. "Now, Edna Winters," she told herself, as she stared out on the white hills, "you might as well look things in the face to night and have it done with. I shall probably spend a great part of my life on this very hill, living on in just the way I did before I knew him. Why not? That is the way Samantha Moore and Jane Williams have been doing these ever so many years. They just keep right on and on and on. Nothing happens to them. There is no change in their lives. Why should there be in mine? They clean house spring and fall, can fruit, go to town, have the sewing society, and so on," and Edna shuddered a little at the picture she had sketched of her own future. These were two neighbours, whose peaceful dwellings nestled among the hills before her. Then she felt condemned as she heard floating up from the sitting room The wild warbling strains of Dundee, her dear father's old voice, with just a little tremble in the tones. How thankful she ought to be for this blessed home of hers. The stove pipe came up from below and warmed her room. She came over to it, and inclined her head to hear the words, "O God, our help in ages past, our strength in years to come, our refuge from the stormy blast, and our eternal home." Sure enough, God, our strength in years to come, even though they be wearisome years. A little stormy blast had swept over her. She would fly to her refuge, and then the eternal home. What if this life was not just as we would have it, the next one will be. And Edna laid her down in peace and slept. "Hi ho!" said Mr. Winters one bright day. "Whom have we here?" A merry jingle of bells suddenly stopped and two grey horses and a handsome sleigh stood in front of the gate. "Mr. Monteith, eh? He has most likely come to take me out riding," he said, with a twinkle in his eye. "Miss Edna, will you ride?" Mr. Monteith asked, when the greetings were over. Edna's eyes sought her mother's for reply. It was not every gentleman, be he ever so great and rich, that this primitive, independent father and mother would entrust with their treasure, their one ewe lamb. Yes, Edna might go, but would he be sure to bring her home before dark? "Trust me, did I not bring her home before dark once?" he laughingly asked. The two were soon tucked among the robes, skimming briskly over the smooth, hard surface which is just the next thing to flying. They flew about the streets of the town a little while, met Miss Paulina, who stared at Edna and said to a young lady by her side, "Whoever can that be with Mr. Monteith?" Then their route stretched many miles out into the quiet country. The journey was long, but not tedious. It was beguiled by low spoken words that kept time to the slow, silvery chime of the bells; the old musical, mysterious words that established a covenant between those two, needing only the word from father and mother and minister to make binding and never ending. Mr. Monteith was said, by belles of the town, to be destitute of a heart; at least all their arts had not succeeded in finding it. Even Miss Percival, skilful as she was, had also failed, much to her sorrow. To be sure, the heart was of small account to her; only so that she might be mistress of the stately Monteith mansion, might possess those grey ponies for her very own, and glitter in the silks and jewels and laces that his money would buy. She had no heart herself, because in her very shallow nature there was not room for one. Paulina had failed thus far, but she was not discouraged. Mr. Monteith's mother was old and feeble; she would die some day, then of course he would need some one to preside over his home, and who so well fitted to adorn it as she, the acknowledged beauty of the town? When the time of birds and blossoms had come again, and picnics and excursions were revived, Paulina said to her dearest friend, "What do you think that delightful man has gotten up now? Mr. Monteith, I mean. He is to have a little breakfast party in the country, just a few of us, you know. We are to go in carriages. I dare say you'll be invited too. Isn't it a charming novelty? I presume it is to an old uncle and aunt of his, you know." And the butterfly girl tripped on without waiting for replies. Accordingly, one balmy June morning, a merry company alighted at the Pines, and were ushered into a fairy-like room. Green vines crept and twined along the white walls, drooping over doors and windows, and trailing down the muslin curtains as if they grew there. The flowers were not made into stiff bouquets, but here and there was a handful of roses or sweet-scented violets. The old fireplace lost itself in callas, ferns, and ivies, while the mantel blossomed out into tuberoses and mosses. One of the recesses formed by the large chimney was turned into a leafy bower, the bells of white lilies fringing the green archway. "Beautiful! Exquisite!" murmured the guests. "I verily believe we have come to a wedding," said one. In another moment Mr. Monteith and his bride stood in the niche under the lilies, and the minister spoke the mystic words that declared them "no more twain but one." Edna was not glittering in satin and jewels. Her dress was apparently a soft white cloud floating about her, looped here and there with a cluster of lilies of the valley. A wreath of the same flowers fastened her veil, and the sweet face and luminous eyes that gleamed through its folds seemed just another rare flower. The formalities and congratulations all over, Mr. and Mrs. Monteith passed down the walk under the spreading branches to their carriage. The apple blossoms showered fragrant blessings on them as they went their way, and the bridegroom whispered, "Do you remember the first time you and I came up this hill together?" Chapter 7